Hello, and welcome to the Heathen's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Siri Vincent Plough, and I'm so glad you're here. This is the show where I explore heathenry through a queer lens. We will be talking about traditional witchcraft, runes, folklore, and so much more. Join us, won't you, as we journey to the ends of the 9 realms and back. I'm going to describe something, and I want you to visualize this as someone you're talking to. You are only allowed to learn about your own culture. You must use magic that your ancestors would have used. In order to learn magic at all, you need to have a pedigree, and to have a pedigree, you need to know exactly who those ancestors were. Regardless of the culture you currently live in, you are only allowed to work within the culture of your ancestors, regardless of your living connection to that culture. How does that feel in your body? When I say those words, how do you feel? Does this sound like something you've heard before? Now, I want you to try to picture the person that you're talking to. And I ask you, is the person you visualized a white supremacist witch, or is this a well-intentioned witch trying to steer you away from cultural appropriation? I began my journey into Norse paganism and magic because I realized that a lot of my practices were not grounded, that they were appropriating from cultures and I wasn't fully aware of the extent. When I first learned magic, it was a time that cultural appropriation wasn't talked about nearly as much as it is now. In order to get away from practices I was taught early on, I decided to dive into heathenry. That, as we all know, led to other problems. Wading through books written by white supremacists, TERFs, and fascists, not sure what information to trust, and then there is other stuff within heathenry that I didn't necessarily want to replicate in my own practice. Discernment is very important for everyone, whether that is spiritual discernment or the ability to analyze information as it's given to you. At the same time, Nordic magic felt good and right for me because I'm surrounded by Nordic immigrants and their ancestors. Scandinavian people in Minnesota are very proud of their heritage, and there are a lot of opportunities to engage in cultural touchstones that are still connected to their countries of origin. I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, but it really did make such a huge difference for me in terms of feeling connected to the practice. If I lived somewhere that didn't have these Scandinavian cultural moments, I think it would have been a lot harder to connect with these practices given all of the other barriers that I mentioned earlier. But what happens when you don't have that personal connection? What do you do if you don't want to be culturally appropriative, but you don't connect with the practices of your ancestral lineage? Or even worse, what if you have had bad or even traumatic associations with the cultural experiences you grew up with? I will clarify that in this episode, I am largely talking to white-bodied people because that is an experience I can speak to. It's something I've thought a lot about as someone who teaches witchcraft and folk magic, as well as someone working to unlearn white supremacy culture in my own life. However, this conversation is important for everyone to engage in. There's a big difference between taking from other cultures indiscriminately and exploring a path that calls to you. And if that path is not within your own personal ancestry, there are ways of engaging ethically with those practices. If you're someone who is already worried about cultural appropriation in your craft, you're probably already sensitive to how you're showing up in cultural spaces that aren't your own. There is cultural appropriation, sure, but there are also plenty of magical systems that are not closed. They can be learned and passed down regardless of direct ancestry. The key is to find those cultural practices that speak to you that are also open to you. I'm going to take a moment here to talk about cultural appropriation because I realize I haven't actually defined it or talked about it yet this episode. Cultural appropriation is the taking of elements of a culture in a way that ultimately distorts or misrepresents that culture. Some examples of cultural appropriation include white people burning sage and calling it smudging, someone wearing a native feather headdress to Coachella, Madonna wearing a bindi, etc. It is usually on a personal scale rather than an institutional scale. For example, while the British Museum taking artifacts from other cultures and displaying them and misrepresenting their history is wrong, that is an example of colonial practice rather than cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is obviously wrong for many reasons. It is done by people who have relative social power over the group they are appropriating from, and often the thing they are appropriating is something the original culture would be punished for. One example is white people wearing their hair in dreadlocks. While this is changing a bit now, historically Black people have been punished for wearing their hair in dreadlocks, though through things like employment and housing discrimination. Meanwhile, white people with dreads don't face the same kind of discrimination. Another layer of cultural appropriation is that often the people who are doing it are profiting from the appropriation. Think metaphysical shops selling dream catchers that were not made by native people but were purchased from a catalog, the overharvesting of white sage and Palo Santo, and so many more examples. In answer to this, some people might argue that actually you should try to make it work with a practice from your own ancestral lineage. And this is a somewhat simple answer to the question of how not to be culturally appropriative. There are several problems with that, and that's why I think that line of thinking is actually more exclusionary than we may believe. First of all, not all of us have neat and easy access to know who our ancestors were. For those who have been adopted, depending on the laws surrounding their adoption and whether or not that adoption was open or closed, they may have no way of knowing their ancestry beyond genetic testing, which can be expensive and unreliable. There are also large swaths of people who have other difficulty accessing their familial and ancestral connections. Unless your family has been keeping records for quite some time, you may need to do all of the legwork, and that's a lot of energy to spend on something if it isn't your passion. Even family records can be unreliable at times. I know there are a couple of ancestors in my family who have been left off the official record because of various family politics. And sometimes the family is just so large that people lose track of each other. Another example from my own family. Then there are other reasons someone may not know where their people come from. For example, many Black Americans are descended from slaves who were brutally dehumanized. Families separated to stop attachments from forming, names changed when they were moved from one place to another, records purposefully obfuscated or destroyed. There are so many Black writers who have talked about this intense grief and separation from ancestry and sense of self that comes with all of this, and I know there is so much deep trauma. Of course, there are many forms of Black American magic that rose as resistance out of this harrowing history, with hoodoo as one example. There are other cultural groups who are systematically disconnected from their ancestors. There are also many people that leave their original country and try to assimilate fully into a new culture, and their children will not have any connection to the culture of their quote-unquote homeland. Many white Americans come from families that embraced whiteness so thoroughly that they're entirely culturally removed from the places they came from. And many other white Americans have such mixed ethnic backgrounds that there is no one culture that it makes sense to explore. And this circles us back around to a cultural disconnect, which is at the heart of the impulse of cultural appropriation. Many activists in this area talk about the void that whiteness leaves behind, and how the urge to commit cultural appropriation comes from an attempt to fill this void with cultural symbols that white people see other groups using. But those aren't up for grabs, and they aren't for us. So how do you fill that void in an appropriate way? You look to the cultures that your ancestors gave up when they became Americans. You dig deeper. But what happens when you do all of that digging and still feel disconnected? Because here's the thing, in telling new practitioners that they have to stick to cultural magic that is, quote unquote, within their bloodline, people who are trying to be anti-racist and inclusive are actually parroting some of the exact same language that white supremacist practitioners use. This logic is perilously close to the ideas of Aryan supremacy, and that's exactly what it is. Stephen McNellan, founder of the Asatru Folk Assembly and known racist piece of shit, leans into ideas of a sort of blood transmission of practice while developing his version of Asatru. According to Stephanie von Schnurbein in her 2016 History of Heathenry, Norse Revival, Transformations of Germanic Neo-Paganism, McNallen came forward with a pseudoscientific metaphysical theory called metagenetics that posits that religious and cultural practices become encoded in our DNA and are passed down that way. McNallen drew heavily on Jungian psychology and argued that archetypes are specific to certain groups and should only be called on by them. It's ridiculous for people who reject McNallen's metagenetics to turn around and essentially say, only practice within your own heritage. It may not have the same bent of supremacy, but it is close to slipping that direction. And when conservative ideals are so tempting, as I talked about in the first episode of this season, if you already have a framework for this kind of exclusion in your practice coming from people that you initially agree with, other conservative ideals can slip in much more easily. But the idea of metagenetics didn't come straight from McNallen. It had its basis in other theories that were put forth by earlier thinkers. This is why, for some people in the pagan communities, these theories don't necessarily appear as the red flags that they are for people. This is not to say that there aren't other theories and writers out there who are questionable. There absolutely are. But we have gotten so used to writers talking about archetypes in a certain way that on the face of it, a phrase like archetypes live in the blood of people with similar ancestry is something that someone who isn't as far down the explicit white supremacist pipeline would recognize. But that is also connected in a much more literal way than vibes. To keep moving forward with the example of archetypes, it is time to talk about everyone's least favorite essay by Carl Jung, Wotan. I'm fairly certain that I've talked about this essay elsewhere on the podcast, and I know I cite it in my book and talk about its problematic legacy. But for those who haven't heard about it before or need a refresher, I'll just do a quick summary here. Wotan with Nietzsche was published in 1936. This was well after Jung had given up his professorship and was in what many refer to as his more hermit-like years. He was disturbed by the rise of Hitler and Nazis in Germany, and he wrote this essay as a sort of way of processing it. In the essay, he essentially writes that the spirit of Wotan has awoken in the German people. The wanderer is equated with those who are traveling throughout Germany to spread the word of Hitler, what he referred to as roving bands of youths, aka the Hitler Youth, terrorizing the countryside, acting on what he said was Wotan's bidding. He talked about Wotan as a war god and how this spirit has been awoken. Now let's talk about what isn't being said. It's not being said here that German Jews are also able to access Wotan, just that Aryan Germans are. This connects it directly to race in a way that is uncomfortable and could play directly into the Nazis' hands. It's serious that this powerful figure from mythology was equated with the movement, and while Wotan can be read as an intellectual who doesn't agree with the ethics of Nazi Germany, it also isn't strident enough in denouncing that connection. The association of an archetype with a particular nationality of people lays the intellectual groundwork for McNallen 50 years later. I find archetypes to be very powerful to work with on a magical basis and have done a lot of archetypal work myself, and Jung's work in the areas of collective unconscious, mythology, and archetypes are ubiquitous and often unquestioned. I think that we trust Jung too much, but that's just me and an entire episode on its own. Another thing that I've noticed, particularly within heathen circles and other European neo-pagans, yes, I'm sorry, this is a call-in, is that people tend to focus on one specific time period within a culture. There is a wealth of information out there about many different eras in Nordic cultural history, and I, for one, find it really fascinating to see how culture shifts over the course of centuries. But many people focus solely on the Viking era. Why is that? How does this narrow focus serve us? I think a big part of this is, of course, that some people struggle to reconcile it with the fact that many of our ancestors committed historic atrocities. We look to a golden age of some glory in the past that is just foreign enough that we can distance ourselves from it while simultaneously embracing it. This is an interesting cognitive dissonance because the Viking era was a time of brutal fighting and even colonizing. So I ask again, why Vikings? If we are to look at all of the different nuances within a cultural history, you can't shy away from these atrocities. You can't ignore them. You might see the Viking era as being a reaction to historic events. It's not the mythic, glorious past. It is a time when people fought, screamed, bled, and died. Figuring out how to hold space for the atrocities of my ancestors while doing ancestor veneration practices is something I still don't have answers to. Working towards reparations is an important action to take. Advocating for policies that benefit and lift up people of color and other marginalized groups is also important. I think sometimes when we're looking at ancestor work, we can get siloed into thinking about it purely in a spiritual way. But the spiritual is not separate from the mundane world. In fact, the mystical is in everything. So these actions are really important in terms of how we attempt to repair the damage done by our ancestors. So instead of putting culturally specific practices in a vacuum and forcing them into one specific period of time, it's important to engage with the nuances. For example, I've also been feeling drawn to Slavic magic lately, and there is such a long and complicated history there that I have to contend with, and a long history between my Slavic ancestors and my Nordic ones. Learning the actual history and being able to put these cultural practices in a broader context is something that is very important to me. Here's the thing. Ancestor veneration is a radical practice. It is a tool for collective and personal liberation. I've had Katie Swallow on the podcast in the past, and we talked fairly extensively about healing unwell ancestors. In next week's interview with Danielle Headington, we talk about how sometimes unwell ancestors come through as monsters. It's important to do ancestor work if we're ever going to heal the psychic wounds from historic atrocities. And also, I have always seen ancestor work as including gently teaching my ancestors what I'm doing. Most of my recent ancestors are Catholic and Lutheran at this point, and they don't know what they're being called into an altar space with Odin until I develop a stronger relationship with them and show them what Odin means to me. They perhaps don't have a concept of the American culture that I live in. Technology is both fascinating and disturbing to many of my ancestors. I say all of this to say that while it is important to engage with some of the things they did in life, I am also working with ancestors and teaching them actively about my strange witchcraft practice. I may bake lucicotter on Santa Lucia Day in honor of my Nordic ancestors, but I also pray to Odin, which is something they would not have done. So even within a practice that is rooted in my Nordic heritage, I still have practices that are unrecognizable to them. You can apply these same actions to doing ancestor work even if your pagan practice isn't within their cultural history. If I was practicing Orphic mysticism, for example, I would be introducing these practices to my ancestors. I might still bake the lucicotter for them, but my primary practice would be Orphic in nature. I hope that makes sense. There are so many nuances to this topic, and nothing is ever a one-size-fits-all. I wanted to end the episode talking about how other white people can determine the differences between a tradition they are welcome to explore and a tradition that is not really open to us or is open by invitation only. The thing is that I don't think any one approach works for all people. I don't want to prescribe anything across the board because I don't think that's right to do. So I wanted to provide some ways forward. If the religious path is specifically practiced by people who have been oppressed by forces of white supremacy, especially in the place where you live and even by your own ancestors, that path is likely not open for you unless you are invited. And you might be invited, but that is most likely if you have strong relationships with people already in that community. In general, I found that many different European magical practices are open for exploration. Celtic magic, Orphic mysticism, Italian folk magic, Polish folk magic, and yes, Norse heathenry. There are also magical practices that are open that are not culturally bound, such as Wicca, Thelema, and Chaos magic. Now, you will need to keep an eye out for cultural appropriation within these traditions. The New Age movement in particular did a lot of damage by stealing Native American imagery and incorporating it into Wicca. There's also a strong Egyptomania to be found in Thelema, which can make me uncomfortable. So still keep a good head on your shoulders. But in general, Wicca is not an inherently appropriative religion. And so tapping into these open traditions is an option for you if you don't connect with your ancestral traditions. I do encourage you to try to get to know people either raised in these traditions or who have a stronger cultural connection to them. It will strengthen your practice. This can be hard if you don't have a local community that you can tap into, if you aren't able to talk to people about your different spiritual paths. And if you want to practice multiple folkways, they can sometimes bump up against each other, which makes things complicated. For example, there are certain ways that I practice Nordic folk magic that may need to adjust as I incorporate more Slavic folk magic, or I just need to be aware of which lineages I'm working with at what times. But it's a lifelong practice. Don't expect perfection overnight. Whew, this was a little longer than my solo episodes tend to be, but it feels good to explore this in such detail. Next time on the podcast, I'm having Sister Danielle Headington to talk about all of this and even more. She is an expert in balancing multiple traditions and a very wise woman I'm proud to be in community with. See you next time. Thank you for listening to the Heathen's Journey podcast. I'm so glad that you could be here. If you are interested in supporting the podcast financially, I would recommend checking out my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Siri Vincent Pluff. And of course, that is linked in the show notes. Until next time, stay weird.